Our next speaker is Jeff Weintraub from the Amplify. Jeff leads technology development for the Amplify, a brand tech company based in Culver City, and specializes in data-driven, influencer-based marketing campaigns for Instagram. Good specialty. He oversees the research and development arm of the firm, where he champions a wide array of products, from prediction engines to content management dashboards, and in an effort to improve the process of creating meaningful content for influencers, brands, and their audiences at scale. He holds dual degrees from Cal State Polytechnic Pomona and a law degree from Southwestern Law School, technician's degree in nanotechnology from Lawrence College of Engineering and University of California, Riverside, and a graduate of the Patent Training Academy at the United States Patent and Trademark Office in Virginia. He'll be talking about deriving conversational insight from learning emoji representations. Please join me in welcoming Jeff.
All right. Yes, this works. Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I know it's like at the end of the day, and you'll hold in there. And I hope if you found this title of this conversation interesting, this will be at least something you can kind of take to your everyday life when you go look at your social media feeds, to kind of figure out some of the interesting things that occur, and maybe something that companies do to try to, gain insight on what everyone's doing, putting on their Instagram, on their Facebook, different areas. So we're going to talk about deriving conversational insight, focusing specifically on how we represent emojis, and largely the reason why this talk is because emojis are quite prevalent, and we'll go over how much that is, but let's get started. So the outline for today is basically to go over emoji adoption, some statistics in terms of the areas that we focus in. We focus on Instagram. The Amplify is basically what we would call a brand tech company. We do sell marketing campaigns. We put together creative. We're a bit of a hybrid marketing agency, but we also have a very serious software development end. I'm ahead of that area, and ultimately what I do is I try to support our creative teams to generate insight from the data that we pull, and we've been pulling data on Instagram for about 4 years. So short of being someone who's actually at Instagram, we have a great store of Instagram data that we've got permission to use, and for us to be able to use our tools and to learn off of. The second thing we're going to do is the emojineering. So basically the fundamentals of engineering in terms of NLP, and how we're going to talk about that in terms of what we use to actually represent emojis within our phrases, within our conversational insights. And then we're going to go over a couple trends that we're seeing from our clients across verticals, just to give you some context in terms of how we service our clients, and ultimately how maybe businesses use our service to kind of optimize their message, and at the same time to try to brand themselves as being in the place where people have the most attention at the moment. So first and foremost, I want to give you some context. So I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig. I recently went on a quick trip to Cancun. This trip was leisurely, but it was also very action-packed. It was a bachelor party. I'm not gonna shy from that. But at the same time, I wanted to post on Instagram. We had visited the ruins at Chichen Itza, which is basically a large sundial, an ancient sundial, and of the Mayan culture. And then at the same time, I put together at least a caption that I wanted to encompass, let all my friends know what I had done, but at the same time I use emojis. So for example, my caption was, oh man, it was a really epic trip. Went to Playa del Carmen, Cancun for a bachelor party, one for the books. And as a human being, if you look through those emojis, you can pretty much figure out that this is a description of the trip. So we got on a plane, we landed into a tropical area. It was nice and sunny. We started having a celebration. There were many, maybe alcoholic drinks consumed, maybe not. There were also tacos that were consumed, maybe not. There was fire that had, you can maybe get some context about what that means. There was some surprises, some splashing of water that needed to wake people up, maybe some more alcoholic drinks, maybe or maybe not consumed, some tacos, some waves. some tropical areas, and then we left. So in terms of what I wanted to convey was, in pictures, my description of an interesting story, and you as a human being know, if fire came after tacos, there might be some context there. In Mexico, like, not to be descriptive, but that likely is something that might occur, and you all understand what that might entail. And as a caveat, to get out to this ruins area takes 2 hours. And then we reluctantly, but we scheduled something until 6 in the morning, and then we basically got on a bus for 2 hours after staying up all night. So, the fire and the tacos and all those things put together, when my friends read that, or when people who know the stories we're talking about, they read that thing and they're like, oh, I know what he's talking about. But at the same time, just reading the fire emoji doesn't really give you the full context. So that's kind of where we're at, is many people are using pictorial language, you could say, in their social media, so that it's a large swath, and it's something that we should capture and necessarily get some description on. So, first thing is just emoji adoption. Who's using it? I'm going to focus my talk on Instagram. We have the most data there. In 2011, basically the emoji keyboard was instituted into iOS. So it was widespread adoption just on that distribution platform. I think it was, October. A couple months goes by, Instagram reported that 10% of their comments had emojis in them. So basically, out of all the comments that were on the platform, 10% of them had emojis. Give it a couple years, give it Android being being adopted, or Instagram adopting Android, and at a certain point around 2015, Instagram estimated that a majority of their comments have emojis. So if you take my example of my caption, maybe 50% of my caption is just pictorial. If I only had something reading like verbatim text and trying to figure that out, the actual Unicode that the emojis are on the back end wouldn't be represented in my conversation. So it's a missed opportunity. And at the same time, most people are comfortable with using emojis now, and it's becoming widely adopted. This is a little bit older data, 2015, but for the most part, we've been seeing, the trend kind of staying in that realm. Instagram also did a study in terms of just cohorts. They tried to compare the adoption of emojis versus the adoption of like slang, LOL, bae, the use of words that had some kind of temporal context. And what they found for the most part is when they tracked cohorts with emojis versus this slang, they found a very strong negative correlation coefficient that basically means the emojis were being adopted and used, but they were not being adopted and used with the slang. The slang was being adopted at a different rate, and for the most part, some of that slang just dies off. So it's kind of just support to say people are using pictorial language to describe something that they want to convey, and at the same time on some of the popular social media websites, they are actually using it and using it in a different way. So just to go over the fundamentals, I know the audience, everyone has different backgrounds, so if you have a technical background, you may be disappointed that there isn't more technical things in this presentation. I am necessarily speaking on behalf of a company, so everything I can't exactly go over, that is our competitive advantage. But I will try to give you the fundamentals of how you can represent emojis, how we maybe go about it, and the way that you can kind of think about if this is a problem you're actually working on. So first and foremost, representing meaning in terms of an emoji, we bring down the assumption basically emojis are Unicode, they're a certain form of information, and at the same time, what we're ultimately trying to do is find the meaning of words. So Webster's Dictionary basically gives us some context, like looking for meaning is basically like an idea that someone's trying to represent into a word or phrase. It's something that someone's trying to express, maybe some concept, and then at the same time, they're trying to likely do it in a work, in their art, in some form of communication. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find meaning in the emojis, in the pictorial representations of people's messages, and to kind of get that into a point where we can scale that across all of our data. So, one way to think about it in terms of having a computer derive this meaning is discrete representation. For example, with words, you use some form of taxonomy, WordNet. You can get the hypernyms and the synonyms. So for example, panda brings you lots of relations to panda. It's an animal, organism, it's living, it's whole, it's an entity. But, if you have an emoji sentence, for example, and you have an emoji with like eye, heart, and then a panda, emoji, I don't exactly know if you're trying to convey, I love organisms, like I love entities, I love living things. So relations give you some context, but they don't exactly give you the value you might be looking for. Similarly, there are synonym sets containing WordNet. You can get the adjectives, the adverbs, nouns, for example, good. You can do just all the different alternatives that you can use for the word good. So the only problem is discrete representation is limited. I mean, as most people you can pretty much deduce. You miss the nuances between a beautician and a stylist. A beautician is not exactly a stylist, and a stylist is not exactly a beautician. So there are small things that we attribute in our own minds from a culture or from our own experience that we kind of miss. And that's a big miss in terms of 160,000 comments. And also new things. So for example, if you're good, you may be a genius, you may be a ninja, you may also just be by people's communication, like you're on fire, or you're 100%. Like these things people use in terms of what they're trying to mean, and ultimately, these are things that you miss when you're doing discrete representation. So, this is my example. This is ultimately similar to a problem that I had, but I had a campaign that basically revolved around figuring out a product launch. Product launch was a Ford GT, and I got this basically example. Was I had to figure out how to get my system to recognize, Ford GTs are the shit, which generally if you're a human being and you know something about culture, like that's a phrase that's generally positive, and Ford GTs are shit is not positive. So the difference between the sentences, and this is fairly fundamental, is just like the preposition the. It's one word. Technically everything else is contained within the two other sentences, but just that one word added with this particular emoji changes that emoji's sentiment, semantic representation, and ultimately could actually be something in the theme of the campaign that we miss. If that's actually what we were trying to do, and we didn't have that insight, and we had lots of data, we're gonna miss it. So ultimately, this is the problem case that we were using, and it's a tough problem, because there's also representation of just text, but there's representation of sentences, phrases. We're gonna go over here today representing the fundamentals like text, individual emojis. Our company does phrase analysis, and we can have an offline conversation about what our capabilities are, but for here, we're gonna focus on text. So we use something called Word2Vec. Word2Vec is a pretty common piece of software that was developed by Google in 2013. And we largely come down to the point of a distributional representation. So what that means is we're basically using a model or an algorithm called Skipgram. Skipgram predicts the context of words given a certain position. So for example, if I want to say I love Ford, and I'm trying to predict the context of words around the heart emoji, I'm basically trying to predict what's in front of it and what's behind it. And based on my data set, there's some probability distribution that says these contact words should be there, or these contact words should be after it. So ultimately, if you understand NLP and doing words to vectors, what we're ultimately doing is returning words and emojis into dense vectors, and each word and emoji has two representative vectors. The vector that's actually the independent like emoji itself, the actual emoji, and then there is a vector for context. Like that heart emoji has a certain vector, and then there's a second vector that gives context of if you have another emoji like the poop emoji, that heart emoji has a meaning, but it's in relation to that poop emoji. So that second vector basically takes care of that context. Scriptgram is basically a statistical probability, it generates the representation based on some form of sampling for the most part, but to kind of nip it in the bud in some sense, we choose a certain radius of words around the actual independent emoji we're trying to do, and then it samples across that. And the problem being is, if you increase the radius, so if you have 300 million words, if you only sample within the first 100 of where you're at, or if you sample between 5, if you do the 100, it increases the complexity massively. Trying to train on a data set and using this algorithm, if you have a large radius, it will take you months. It may take you days. It could take you hours. So ultimately, what we end up trying to do is have an efficient training, because ourselves, temporally in social media conversation, things lap over most of the time. It's in our best interest to be able to train as much as possible, because there's new things that get adopted, new slang, new emojis, so we try to optimize for that. So ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to reduce training complexity, which also means we try to find a sweet spot in between the radius of the words outside of emojis and text that we're trying to keep track of. And then ultimately we're giving outputs of dimensionality, and our training data set is basically, it's about 300 dimensional vectors. We have 6 billion tokens, and then ultimately what we do is we are mapping to a poly distribution using softmax, and then just standard tools like stochastic gradient descent to basically tune our parameters. So the result is we just make a visualization, and we have more advanced tools than this, but this is just a fundamental kind of thing. Is for example, there's a heart emoji next to wow. There is a car next to sick, and ultimately these are giving 3-point locations. So if you pick one emoji, and if there's an emoji that is a Euclidean distance close to it, then it was used similarly within the context of using the scriptgram algorithm. So if I used Ford, and if I had the word tired or coffee, it may have been used in similar ways. So ultimately what we do is we have some manual inspection, but we also have lots of checks to basically make sure that even on an actual human perspective, some of this stuff, it works. This is a very basic kind of data set, but it just shows, for the most part, when you have text and you can represent an emoji with similar kind of context, we can basically derive and see how closely the conversation was talking about certain things, and then go back up to the top and see, okay, what were the sentences that we were using? What were people talking about at that time? Where was people's attention? To basically derive the conversation on the next iteration that says, focus more on this, focus more on the car being associated with like a heart emoji, or the message being more closely associated with certain things, and we see that kind of distance collapse in, and we know we've got a nice tight conversation going on around certain aspects. So, like I said, we've been pulling data for about 4 years on Instagram. We have a number of clients that are all Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, and what we end up doing is we just put together some statistics on different verticals that we service. So one of those verticals is entertainment. Across largely all of our data sets, like within this vertical, we see that like the top 10 emojis used circumfix a majority of the conversation. So meaning what we'll do is we'll tell our clients, look, we're seeing a lot of activity using this type of feedback mechanism. They're doing it with emojis. They're talking about these types of concepts. And we advise our clients, look, we're seeing a lot of this being repeated. There's something here. let's run another leg of the analysis, and we'll figure out, okay, here's where you need to focus. Here's the sweet spot. And especially in entertainment, there's lots of, there's lots of lighter types of emojis used, heart emojis, a lot of I love this, a lot of you could say they're not as directed towards a certain thing. They may be more of a, oh, I really like this. This is really amazing. But ultimately, most of our entertainment clients, they're looking for that because they want to know immediately whether this is going to do good at the box office or not. I mean, they're not trying to do a philosophical conversation. They're ultimately trying to get it out there and trying to see how it might be received. Sure. Depending on which emojis that we're doing, so we will do an analysis in terms of what the KPIs are and then what the message is for the brands. And we will tune our relevancy kind of algorithms to basically go for that. So we'll see things between 30 to 50% sometimes, because one thing that we do use is we will use large influencers, so we have lots and lots of data to go through, and for the most part there is some of those people that their conversation will not necessarily be directed at the client, or may not be directed at the message that possibly the client is trying to do. So what we ultimately do is we start from kind of a baseline, and then we use our relevancy based on the message and what the strategy is to kind of tune to where the client wants to go. Because ultimately, there's always going to be the people commenting on Selena Gomez, like, I love you. It has nothing to do with the exact message, but short of the tools that we have, ultimately we end up having to get in here with these things and then kind of tune as we go. So. Sure.
The 65% top 10 emojis, are there specific top 10 emojis like worldwide, or is it just like
Across everyone that we have that is an entertainment vertical, of all the data we pulled from Instagram, 65% of the emojis that were used were just 10. So meaning everyone that we've worked with that's looking to put out a message that is in the entertainment industry, for example, the conversation that comes back to us a lot is those 10, and it's a majority of the conversation. So, meaning if it was less, then the heart emojis or whatever the top 10, whatever the number one emoji was, doesn't exactly have much weight. So we try to figure out, okay, well maybe there's more weight in text or certain types of keywords or certain other emojis that might be used. So. Well, and I'll try to repeat because I think this is the only thing that's likely on this. So, across retail, it's a little bit different. Top 10 emojis drops, and then the statistics in themselves drop because retail is, as you all know, in the digital space, is you're either searching for it on Google, or you're looking for it as inspiration on social media, or you're going to Amazon. So retail, CPG, all those types of things have barriers in some sense on the digital sphere. But what we end up trying to do is getting lots of product feedback, and we end up trying to inspire a message that then allows it, for whatever means that we do have, to direct somebody to, if they want to go purchase something or if they want to click on something, they can, and we try to just craft our message to be around that. So in retail, it's a little bit harder than entertainment for those reasons, but at the same time, being able to isolate 10 emojis to then feed back into the message that the client is trying to convey is really valuable because they can sit and say, okay, like, I at least know I'm at a certain level here with these communication tools. Let's do the next pass and see if we can optimize. And then beauty. So beauty has lots of feedback for the most part, and is very conducive to using, for example, the top 10 emojis, which are usually like, happy faces, hearts, things of that nature. Obviously, in terms of beauty, it's more visually appealing most of the time. There's more pictures of makeup, there's more selfies, there's more things that are actually descriptively contained within something visual. So what we do end up having is some tools that are not the purpose of this conversation, but basically we have tools that we try to figure out exactly what in the photo is being referenced, and then how are we referencing that back with the conversation we're getting back from people. So in terms of emojis, like they're all over the place with beauty, but ultimately what we end up doing is doing a really better job in focusing on is the semantic relevance between the content and the actual conversation. Because most of the time, it's very hard for you to describe like a picture of a model using mascara. Like you can say, I really love the mascara, but there are aspects of the photo that you can't convey, so you use the, if it wasn't mascara or if it was nail polish, you use the nail polish emoji. So depending on the strategy, that would be highly relevant and would have bumped this up. So oftentimes what we end up doing is getting this baseline so we can then inform the creatives and the people on our team that are actually trying to come up with different strategies to say, hey, focus on what we're seeing here and try to get this relevancy up, because we're seeing the contrast between how are these images being received and then what's the feedback we're getting from people. I don't know exactly what the time is. 5 minutes? Okay, great. I timed this well. Sweet. So, we went over emoji adoption, some of the basic fundamentals of just doing word representation into vectors, and then conversational insights. So, we have 5 minutes. If you have any questions, let me know. But thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. So. Sure. Yeah, exactly. And also, we do notice that with some of these, people use like emoji sentences. So in some sense, for example, mine, the fire emoji was necessarily relevant to what I was talking about on my trip, but there isn't anything of, I got a stomach ache as an emoji, So similarly with beauty, we find a lot of the people giving feedback are giving us feedback, but necessarily the vocabulary of emojis is we think is insufficient to be able to explicitly say, hey, this emoji, like this verbatim showing to somebody, means I really like this nail polish. It's usually a combination of things at the end of a story that we end up saying, okay, they were using these heart emojis, they were using these things in the context of talking about this is their favorite product. So we try to end up because in those heart emojis are used elsewhere, which are not relevant, so we end up having to kind of craft strategies to say, okay, we can see where we're at baseline and then go from there with the emojis that we have. So
then a heart doesn't count as semantically relevant?
it does, because we will track which of those, the heart basically gets informed by all the other contexts. So the heart may be used lots of other places, but we are looking for the heart and used in terms of, like, for example, other words like love, or maybe the product, or nail, or other things that would basically pertain to beauty. And since the heart is used mostly, what the model basically does is it's taking all of the hearts and then trying to pinpoint, okay, where was it at in relation to something else? And then we ultimately have to craft a strategy that says, this point from this heart to where we want to go, the word nail or for example, whatever, is our kind of relevancy metric. We want to get as close as possible to the conversation. And it's also very hard because we're getting 160,000 comments, in maybe a couple hours or a couple days. And then we're trying to optimize on top of it and then train our model again. So we end up having to chase up all the emojis to kind of figure out that nuance of, is the heart emoji being used for the relevancy we need for the most part? Cool. Oh, one more.
For your vertical, do you use LDA to figure out your vertical, or?
No, largely the verticals are informed by metadata, and at the same time, there is some human crafting. Because when we start a campaign, we do have people that create a strategy, and the strategy is largely geared towards entertainment, for example. So there is some kind of just compartmentalization of our data, and then all that data is tied to those campaigns, so we can kind of just deduce that this is part of the entertainment vertical. But for the most part, it's based on metadata that we get, like demographic data, people who had commented on this in aggregate, you know, they follow accounts that have to do with beauty, these beauty brands. So we have some feature engineering in terms of trying to get that in, but for the most part, it's kind of, it's a little bit more human. We're trying to spice up what the vertical is, because ultimately we're trying to satisfy the client, and you know, they don't exactly want to see all of the interesting technical things. They just want to say, okay, this applies to me because the strategy was an entertainment strategy. So.
If I'm reading a text, if I'm reading a comment, sometimes you have emojis being repeated, and you have given a single emoji, a single number, a single polarity, right? Then if the repetition is there, the model effects get affected by that?
So the question is if you have an emoji that continuously gets repeated.
Yeah, like 2 hearts in a comment, that affects the model, or?
Yeah, I mean, it does affect the model, but what the algorithm Skookum does is, for the most part, let me see if I can find it. It takes into consideration the context, and then if we see, for example, we have this issue because, you know, even in my post, I had like 4 fire emojis. So if you see 4 fire emojis, then we know when we're kind of tuning parameters, like, well, some people use fire emojis like 4 or 5 times. So not exactly here for this conversation, but we do have some phrase kind of management, where we basically input and say, okay, now we have phrases. Specific phrases like I love you, specific phrases like 4 emojis, specific phrases, you know, like I heart a robot. Things that are more sentences that aren't the subject necessarily of here, but that we have layered on top, and other models that we deal with that type of thing. Great, I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much. Hope you found it interesting.